For nearly 400 years, there existed a civilization so enormous that European cartographers repeatedly devoted entire sections of their atlases to its existence without ever feeling compelled to explain themselves. This civilization was called Tartaria, and perhaps the most unsettling aspect of its story is not its rise, but rather the extraordinary normality with which it was once discussed. Nobody spoke of Tartaria as a legend. Nobody framed it as mythology, folklore, or rumour. It was presented matter-of-factly, in exactly the same manner that one might discuss France, Persia, or China. If one were to enter a library in London in the year 1750 and ask an educated gentleman where Tartary was located, he would likely gesture eastward with mild impatience, wondering why such an obvious question required answering at all. Yet if we ask the same question today, the response is often bewilderment. Somewhere between then and now, an empire occupying millions of square miles slipped quietly through the fingers of human memory. Tonight, we shall assume that this was no accident. To understand Tartaria, we must first understand maps themselves. Today, maps are disposable objects. They live inside telephones, update automatically, and are trusted only insofar as they can guide us to a restaurant. 300 years ago, however, maps were among the most important instruments of statecraft ever produced. A map was not merely a drawing, it was an expensive declaration of reality. Governments commissioned them, merchants financed them, explorers risked their lives to improve them. Errors could cost fortunes, ships could be lost, trade routes could collapse, wars could begin. There was little incentive for a cartographer to invent an empire for amusement, particularly one that would continue appearing on maps for centuries afterward. Consider the Dutch Golden Age. During the 17th century, Amsterdam had become one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. The Dutch East India Company was accumulating enormous wealth. Sailors were circumnavigating the globe, and mapmaking had become both a science and an art form. Men such as Gerard Mercator, Jodocus Hondius, Willem Bleu, and Joan Bleu produced atlases so magnificent that wealthy families displayed them in their homes as symbols of sophistication. These men did not work in isolation. They shared information gathered from merchants, missionaries, diplomats, soldiers, and sea captains returning from distant lands. Their reputations depended upon accuracy. Yet again and again, one word continued appearing in astonishingly large letters: Tartaria. And not merely Tartaria, Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Little Tartary. The subdivisions themselves suggest administration. One does not subdivide an abstraction. One of the most curious aspects of Tartaria is that it appears to have possessed something very unlike the empires we are accustomed to studying. When we think of great civilizations, we instinctively search for a ruler. We search for an emperor, a dynasty, a royal family, or at the very least a capital city. The Roman Empire had Rome. The Ottoman Empire had Constantinople. The British Empire had London. Yet when historians search for Tartaria, they often encounter a frustrating absence. There is no singular city that modern scholarship confidently points toward and proclaims, "This was the heart of Tartaria." Tonight, we shall assume that this is not because no such heart existed, but because it was deliberately removed from memory. In fact, perhaps we have been asking the wrong question altogether. What if Tartaria did not organize itself around a singular capital? What if it was something considerably more sophisticated? Suppose, for a moment, that the empire functioned as a vast network rather than a centralized kingdom. Instead of one seat of power, imagine dozens of autonomous regions operating beneath a common cultural identity. Such a structure would explain many of the mysteries surrounding its disappearance. Destroying a capital is straightforward. Destroying an idea is much more difficult. One must dismantle every piece simultaneously and then persuade future generations that those pieces were never connected in the first place. If this sounds familiar, that may be because modern societies have begun adopting similar models. Today we communicate through decentralized systems. Information travels instantly between distant cities without requiring a singular command center. A person in Austin can collaborate with someone in Tokyo without either individual ever setting foot inside a government building. Perhaps Tartaria discovered such principles long before the modern age. Perhaps its strength was not its armies, but its interconnectedness. This notion becomes particularly intriguing when we examine the regions repeatedly associated with Tartary on old maps. The territory was astonishingly vast. It encompassed immense portions of Siberia, Mongolia, present-day Kazakhstan, western China, and sometimes even portions of Eastern Europe. We are not speaking of fertile river valleys alone. We are speaking of mountain ranges, frozen tundra, deserts, forests, and steppe grasslands stretching farther than the eye could ever hope to see. Conventional history would have us believe these were simply sparsely populated lands inhabited by unrelated groups. But tonight, we shall entertain another possibility. Perhaps these environments were not obstacles to Tartarians at all. Perhaps they were their greatest advantage. Ancient civilizations have often been underestimated because modern people assume technological advancement must resemble our own. We think in terms of engines, factories, and electrical grids. But perhaps Tartarian technology followed an entirely different path. What if they learned to cooperate with geography rather than conquer it? A people who understood seasonal migration, atmospheric conditions, and natural energy patterns might have required far less infrastructure than we imagine. Their empire may have looked invisible to outsiders precisely because it was designed to blend with the landscape rather than dominate it. Curiously, there are hints of this philosophy hidden in plain sight. Many of the peoples historically associated with Tartary were renowned horsemen. European observers frequently described extraordinary mobility among populations inhabiting the Eurasian steppe. Entire communities could relocate with remarkable speed, carrying their possessions, livestock, and knowledge with them. Traditional historians often portray this mobility as primitive, but perhaps they had it backwards. Perhaps permanence was the less sophisticated solution. Why build rigid cities that can be conquered when one can create adaptable societies that simply flow around threats? The more one studies Tartaria through this lens, the stranger the official narrative begins to appear. We are told that millions upon millions of square miles were occupied by unrelated groups who somehow shared trade routes, cultural exchanges, architectural similarities, and repeated classifications under one enormous name, all without belonging to a larger civilization. It is an explanation that, while certainly possible, begins to feel increasingly unsatisfying once examined closely. Tonight, we shall instead imagine that Tartaria represented an ancient super network connecting hundreds of regional societies beneath a single identity. One of the greatest clues may lie beneath our feet, though most of us rarely think about it. Consider the Silk Road. School children are often taught that the Silk Road was a trade route connecting east and west. The phrase itself is somewhat misleading because there was never one road. There were thousands of roads. Caravans traversed deserts, crossed mountains, followed rivers, and connected cities separated by thousands of miles. Merchants exchanged silk, spices, porcelain, precious stones, and ideas. Yet perhaps the Silk Road was not merely a trade network at all. Perhaps it was the skeleton of Tartaria itself. Imagine an empire that did not define itself through borders, but through movement. An empire whose arteries were roads instead of walls. Such a civilization would appear remarkably difficult to conquer because there would be no singular point of failure. Attack one city and dozens of others remain untouched. Destroy one region and knowledge simply flows elsewhere. In many ways, it would resemble the internet, a distributed organism rather than a traditional state. This would also explain another peculiarity found in old accounts. European travellers often described the peoples of these regions with a strange mixture of awe and confusion. Some accounts emphasized their hospitality, while others described extraordinary resilience. Certain travellers remarked upon immense distances covered in relatively short periods of time. Others noted sophisticated systems of communication that allowed information to travel faster than expected. Conventional historians attribute these observations to efficient horseback courier systems inherited from Mongol traditions. Tonight, however, we might imagine that these systems were merely the surviving remnants of something much older. Let us visit Paris in the year 1751. Within the pages of the great French encyclopédie, scholars attempt to catalogue all human knowledge. They discuss Tartary almost casually. There is no breathless excitement attached to it, no dramatic declarations. It is simply another entry among thousands. This, perhaps, is one of the strongest clues we possess. Erased histories often leave behind strange pockets of normality. The truth survives not in spectacular evidence, but in mundane references. People stop noticing things they assume everyone already knows. It is rather like discovering an old family photograph containing a mysterious person standing in the background. Nobody labelled them because everybody recognized them at the time. 200 years later, however, their identity has been forgotten entirely. The photograph remains, but the context has vanished. This may be precisely what happened to Tartaria. And if that is true, the 19th century suddenly becomes extraordinarily important. Because this is when the word begins to die. It does not disappear overnight. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it fades gradually. Maps become more specific. New national boundaries emerge. Russia expands westward and eastward simultaneously. China consolidates territories. Explorers arrive with new classifications. old labels quietly vanish, great Tartary shrinks, independent Tartary disappears, little Tartary dissolves into other names. Each change appears harmless in isolation. Yet over the course of several decades, an entire civilization evaporates. Imagine how one might intentionally erase an empire without attracting suspicion. One would not burn every book. That would be impossible. One would simply rename things. One generation would still remember Tartaria. The next generation would learn alternative names alongside it. By the third generation, Tartaria would appear old-fashioned. By the fourth, obsolete. By the fifth, absurd. Human memory, it turns out, is astonishingly fragile. Most people can recall the names of their grandparents. Fewer can name all of their great-grandparents. Beyond that, memory rapidly disintegrates. Entire civilizations could disappear in less than 200 years if institutions actively encouraged forgetting. Perhaps that is exactly what happened, but if an empire truly existed, one question inevitably remains: who wanted it gone? That answer, as we shall discover, may have everything to do with the world that emerged afterward, because the 19th century was not merely an age of industrialization, it was an age of ownership. Governments were becoming larger, census systems were becoming more sophisticated, borders were hardening, populations were being categorized, taxed, and administered with unprecedented precision. A decentralized civilization like Tartaria would have represented a threat to every emerging modern state on Earth. It is difficult to tax people who do not identify with your nation. It is difficult to govern populations who maintain older allegiances. It is difficult to monopolize technology that already belongs to everyone. Perhaps the disappearance of Tartaria was not an act of destruction at all. Perhaps it was an act of replacement. And perhaps the maps they forgot to erase are simply the first loose threads of a tapestry that, once pulled, reveals an entirely different story of human civilization. If the maps were the first whisper that something had been removed from human history, then the buildings were the evidence that somebody had forgotten to finish the job. For many people who descend into the Tartarian rabbit hole, this is where suspicion transforms into certainty. Maps can be explained away, names can change, borders can be redrawn, but stone is much more stubborn than paper. Stone remains. Stone endures. Stone sits quietly for centuries, daring future generations to ask who truly built it. Tonight, as far as we are concerned, the answer is not who we have been told. Perhaps one of the strangest experiences in the modern world is standing in front of an enormous 19th century building and experiencing an immediate sense that something does not quite add up. Millions of people have felt this sensation without necessarily being able to articulate it. It is not a feeling of impossibility so much as a feeling of disproportion. One stands before a train station, a courthouse, a state capitol, a cathedral, an opera house, or an old post office, and instinctively wonders why so much effort was expended. Why were ordinary public buildings constructed with such grandeur? Why are there giant columns where simple supports would have sufficed? Why are there enormous domes, elaborate sculptures, immense windows, and decorative metalwork requiring thousands upon thousands of hours of labour? Why does a building intended to sort letters resemble a palace? The official answer is relatively straightforward. We are told that 19th century societies valued beauty more than efficiency. Labour was cheaper than it is today, and governments invested heavily in public works. Tonight, however, we shall assume that these explanations are only partially true. Perhaps these societies were not creating masterpieces from scratch at all. Perhaps they were merely inheriting them. Imagine arriving in a city after a great collapse. The previous civilization has disappeared. Their buildings remain. Some are damaged, some are buried, some have been stripped of whatever technologies once animated them. Yet the structures themselves survive. They are too large to demolish and too magnificent to ignore. What would you do? The answer is obvious. You would move in. You would assign them new purposes. One building would become a courthouse. Another would become a library. Another would become a government office. Within a generation, the population would stop thinking of these structures as inherited and begin believing they had always belonged to them. Perhaps this happened everywhere. The theory becomes particularly compelling when one begins comparing cities separated by enormous distances. Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, London, Prague, Vienna, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Moscow, and countless others all possess strangely similar architectural characteristics. Enormous stone facades, perfect symmetry, grand staircases, decorative ironwork, massive domes, impossibly tall ceilings, ornamental flourishes that seem almost excessive in their complexity. Conventional history attributes these similarities to architectural movements such as Beaux-Arts, Neoclassicism, and the City Beautiful movement. Yet tonight, we shall imagine these styles are not imitations at all. They are remnants. It is often said that architecture is frozen music. If that is true, then perhaps Tartaria left behind an entire symphony. One of the first things that begins to stand out is scale. Modern people have become somewhat desensitized to size because we live in an age of skyscrapers, yet verticality is not the same thing as grandeur. A glass office tower is tall, but it is often unimaginative. Many older buildings, by contrast, possess a kind of theatrical magnificence that feels almost irrational. Consider a train station. Why does a transportation hub need marble floors, giant chandeliers, hand-carved stone ceilings, and arches rising several stories overhead? Why would ordinary commuters require an environment resembling an imperial palace? The answer may be that the building was never designed for commuters in the first place. The same questions apply to courthouses. Across North America and Europe, one can find courthouses that look more appropriate for kings than for lawyers. Gigantic pillars tower over relatively small towns. Intricate sculptures decorate rooftops where almost nobody can appreciate them from the ground. Massive domes dominate skylines despite serving no obvious structural necessity. If efficiency had been the goal, countless simpler designs could have accomplished the same tasks. Yet these immense structures exist everywhere. Perhaps efficiency was never the goal. Perhaps functionality was secondary. Perhaps these buildings served purposes we no longer understand. Many Tartarian researchers become particularly interested in domes. Once one notices them, they seem to appear everywhere. state capitals, cathedrals, observatories, train stations, exhibition halls, and government buildings all seem to possess variations of the same design language. Some theorize that these domes were not decorative at all, but rather components of a larger energy collection system. Instead of generating electricity through burning fossil fuels, perhaps Tartarians harvested atmospheric energy directly from the environment. At first glance, this sounds fantastical, yet it is worth remembering that electricity itself once seemed magical. A person from the year 1700 would likely regard a smartphone as an impossible artifact. Perhaps our descendants will eventually discover that our own technologies were primitive stepping stones toward something far more elegant. Maybe Tartaria had already reached that destination long ago. This theory becomes even more intriguing when examining ornamental metalwork. Modern observers often dismiss decorative spires, finials, antenna-like structures, and rooftop embellishments as purely aesthetic choices. Yet their placement is remarkably consistent across continents. Many old buildings feature elaborate metal crowns that seem oddly engineered for mere decoration. What if these were receivers? What if the buildings themselves functioned as giant machines? The notion is certainly dramatic, but there is something strangely satisfying about it. Suddenly, details that once seemed excessive begin to feel purposeful. Giant windows may not have existed simply to admit sunlight. High ceilings may not have existed simply to impress visitors. Intricate lattice work may not have existed simply because artisans had spare time. Perhaps every feature once performed a role in a larger system. Of course, every civilization leaves fingerprints upon its creations, and perhaps the most striking fingerprint of Tartaria was harmony. There is an extraordinary consistency to many older structures that modern societies rarely reproduce. Buildings were not designed as isolated objects, but as components of an integrated whole. Streets aligned with plazas, parks connected to monuments, public spaces flowed naturally into one another. There was an apparent understanding that cities were living organisms rather than collections of unrelated projects. Modern urban planners have spent decades attempting to recreate this effect with varying degrees of success, but perhaps they are unknowingly attempting to reverse engineer something that already existed. Consider the idea of a city as an energy network rather than a population center. Suddenly, enormous avenues make sense. Wide boulevards could facilitate circulation systems we no longer comprehend. Massive public squares could function as gathering points for energy distribution. Towers and domes could serve as atmospheric collectors. Water features could become components of a technological ecosystem rather than mere decoration. What appears ornamental to us may have once been infrastructural. This theory also helps explain why so many older cities possess an unmistakable feeling of permanence. They were not designed for quarterly profits or temporary trends. They were designed to endure for centuries. In many cases, they have done exactly that. Modern societies routinely demolish buildings after 50 years. Tartarian structures appear almost immortal by comparison. And yet, if they were truly inherited, why would governments claim ownership of them? The answer may be surprisingly practical. Imagine inheriting a machine whose purpose you no longer understand. You can't allow the public to know that you are equally confused, because authority depends upon certainty. Therefore, you create a story. You commission histories. You establish timelines. You attribute construction to known architects. You simplify the narrative until it becomes digestible. Eventually, nobody questions it anymore. This is not to say that the architects themselves were fictional. Quite the opposite. Perhaps many 19th century architects were not builders at all, but restorers. Perhaps they were tasked with cataloguing, repairing, and adapting inherited structures. Their names survive because they were among the first people to interact with Tartaria after its collapse. This would explain why certain construction timelines appear so astonishingly compressed. Entire neighborhoods seem to emerge within years. Massive public buildings appear in cities with relatively small populations. Extraordinary feats of engineering are attributed to societies that were simultaneously struggling with disease outbreaks, transportation limitations, and political instability. Could they have accomplished such things? Certainly. Human beings are capable of astonishing achievements, but tonight we shall entertain another possibility. Perhaps they did not have to start from zero. Perhaps they were simply uncovering what was already there. One detail that repeatedly captures the imagination of Tartarian researchers is the phenomenon of photographs showing giant empty cities. Early images from the 19th century and early 20th century often depict immense streets devoid of crowds. Grand buildings stand in eerie silence. Boulevards stretch into the distance with surprisingly few people present. Official explanations point toward long exposure times and low population density, both of which are perfectly reasonable. Yet tonight, we shall imagine something different. Perhaps these were not thriving cities at all. Perhaps they were freshly inherited ruins being repopulated by survivors. Imagine being born into a world after a civilization-ending catastrophe. The streets exist, the buildings exist, but their creators are gone. You occupy a world larger than your population can realistically fill. Entire districts remain empty. Gigantic structures dwarf the communities living inside them. Generations pass before humanity slowly repopulates what was left behind. This would explain an odd emotional sensation many people experience when visiting old cities. They often describe feeling small, not merely physically small, but historically small, as though they are intruding upon a place that was designed for someone else. Perhaps that intuition is not entirely wrong. As we continue our journey, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The maps may have provided the names, but the buildings provided the fingerprints. They stand all around us in plain sight, simultaneously ordinary and impossible. We walk past them every day, without asking who truly conceived them, who powered them, or why their beauty seems to exceed practical necessity at every turn. And perhaps that is precisely why they were allowed to remain. Destroying an empire is difficult, erasing a memory is easier, but repurposing a civilization is easiest of all. After all, if one can convince humanity that its greatest inheritance was actually its own accomplishment, then the past becomes impossible to recover. And yet, beneath many of these buildings, another mystery quietly waits for us. A mystery that may explain not only why the empire disappeared, but where much of it went. Because in cities all over the world, the first floors are buried. If Tartaria was a civilization that spanned enormous portions of the earth, then its disappearance demands an explanation proportionate to its size. Empires do not simply evaporate. They may fracture, they may be conquered, and they may gradually decline over centuries. But they do not vanish with such thoroughness that future generations forget they ever existed at all. The Roman Empire collapsed, and yet its roads remain, its language survives, and its influence permeates much of the modern world. Ancient Egypt endured countless invasions, but its monuments still rise from the desert. Even civilizations that were violently destroyed have left behind coherent stories. Tartaria, however, seems to have suffered a different fate entirely. Tonight, we shall assume that this was because Tartaria did not slowly decline. It was interrupted. To understand the mud flood theory, we must first abandon the image that the phrase itself tends to conjure. The words sound almost comical at first encounter, as though someone simply spilled a giant bucket of dirt across a city. But proponents of Tartaria are imagining something considerably more terrifying. They are imagining a planetary event, not necessarily an apocalypse in the biblical sense, but a rapid environmental transformation so vast that it altered nearly every major settlement on Earth within a relatively short span of time. If true, this would not be remembered as a war or a natural disaster. It would represent a reset. The first clue, according to our narrative tonight, can be found in cities all over the world. One begins to notice old buildings whose proportions feel strangely incorrect. Grand entrances are partially submerged. Decorative windows sit beneath street level. Stone staircases descend downward rather than upward. Entire first floors appear to have disappeared into the earth. This phenomenon is not confined to one country. It appears in Russia, France, Italy, Germany, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and the United States. One could spend years travelling from city to city and repeatedly encounter the same peculiar sight. A building clearly designed to sit proudly upon the ground instead appears as though it has slowly sunk into it. Official explanations exist, of course. Cities raise their street levels over time. Sewage systems require modifications. Roads are widened. Flood mitigation projects accumulate layer after layer of material. These explanations are perfectly reasonable when discussing individual buildings. Tonight, however, we shall imagine a larger picture. Perhaps all of these observations are fragments of a singular event that historians eventually learn to explain away in pieces. Imagine standing in a thriving Tartarian city, sometime in the early 19th century. The streets are alive with movement, towers rise into the sky, public squares hum with activity. Waterways connect districts with elegant efficiency. Then something begins to change. Perhaps the air grows heavy. Perhaps the horizon darkens. Perhaps a distant rumbling travels beneath the earth itself. Nobody recognizes what is happening because nothing like it has ever occurred before. Then, within days, weeks, or months, an unimaginable amount of sediment begins to move across the planet. Where did it come from? That is one of the great mysteries of the theory, and several possibilities have emerged. Some suggest a celestial event. Others propose enormous volcanic eruptions. Still others speculate that the Earth itself experienced a sudden displacement of its crust. More imaginative interpretations suggest that Tartaria fell victim to a technology it could not control, a catastrophic release of energy powerful enough to disrupt the entire surface of the planet. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Cities were not destroyed in the conventional sense. They were entombed. Imagine an avalanche, but not of snow. Imagine billions upon billions of tons of fine sediment flowing across continents, filling streets, swallowing lower floors, and transforming landscapes almost overnight. Unlike lava, it would not burn structures down. Unlike earthquakes, it would not necessarily topple every building. Instead, it would preserve them in a strange, half-finished state. Windows would become basement openings. Front doors would become underground entrances. Entire districts would vanish beneath a newly elevated world. Perhaps this is why so many old photographs possess an unusual atmosphere. In numerous images from the 19th century, construction projects appear less like new developments and more like excavation sites. Workers dig enormous trenches around already existing buildings. Massive quantities of earth are removed from city centres. Horse-drawn carts haul away endless loads of dirt. Officially, these are infrastructure projects. Tonight, however, we shall imagine another possibility. Perhaps humanity was not building cities. Perhaps it was unearthing them. The implications become profound once this idea takes hold. Imagine an entire generation growing up amidst buried civilizations. Their daily lives would revolve around recovery rather than innovation. Governments would prioritize excavation. Labor forces would be assembled not to construct from scratch but to reclaim what had been lost. Streets would be reopened. Buildings would be stabilized. Districts would be reassigned new purposes. To future generations, all of this activity would appear indistinguishable from construction. Perhaps that confusion was inevitable. One of the more curious details frequently noted by Tartarian researchers involves old photographs depicting children standing inside gigantic excavation pits. In many cases, enormous retaining walls tower above them. Staircases emerge from underground. Large portions of cities appear to be missing their surrounding soil. Individually, none of these photographs prove anything extraordinary. Collectively, however, they begin to tell a different story. They suggest a civilization engaged in a massive recovery effort. The question then becomes, who survived? If Tartaria truly suffered a global catastrophe, the answer may be surprisingly few. Great civilizations often create an illusion of permanence, but population density can be remarkably fragile. A single catastrophic event can erase millions of lives in an extraordinarily short period of time. The survivors would have faced challenges beyond imagination. Food systems would have collapsed. Transportation networks would have failed. Communication between distant regions would have ceased almost instantly. Entire generations of accumulated knowledge could disappear in a matter of years. Perhaps this explains another strange feature of the 19th century. The world appears to modern historians as simultaneously advanced and primitive. We see extraordinary engineering feats alongside astonishing hardship. We see magnificent buildings alongside rampant disease. We see technological breakthroughs occurring amidst profound social instability. It is almost as though humanity was trying desperately to rebuild itself while suffering from amnesia. Maybe that is precisely what was happening. Consider the psychological consequences of surviving a civilizational collapse. Imagine being a child born shortly after such an event. Your grandparents vaguely remember another world, but their memories are fragmented and traumatic. Your parents are occupied with survival. Governments are newly formed and struggling to establish order. Giant abandoned structures surround you, but nobody fully understands their original purpose. Under such circumstances, myths would quickly become history, and history would quickly become myth. Within 3 generations, certainty would disappear. This may be why the 19th century feels strangely transitional. It is an era filled with beginnings. New nations emerge, new institutions arise, new identities form, entire populations are categorized and reorganized, school systems expand, standardized histories appear, population censuses become common, official records multiply. Perhaps humanity was not entering modernity for the first time. Perhaps it was reconstructing it. If this interpretation is correct, then the mud flood was not merely an environmental event. It was a memory event. It severed humanity's relationship with its own past. It transformed inheritance into mystery. It forced survivors to become archaeologists without realizing it. There is also an unsettling possibility that the catastrophe was not entirely natural. Some Tartarian theorists have suggested that the mud flood was deliberately induced. If Tartaria possessed technologies beyond our current understanding, perhaps rival factions sought to neutralize them. Maybe competing powers weaponized environmental forces. Maybe a war occurred on a scale so immense that later generations could scarcely comprehend it. History is filled with examples of victors rewriting the past, but perhaps this was the first conflict in which the battlefield itself was erased. If so, then the true weapon was not mud. It was forgetfulness. Because once people forget who built the world around them, they become extraordinarily easy to govern. They inherit magnificent systems without understanding them. They accept simplified explanations because complexity feels overwhelming. They begin to believe that civilization started exactly when their textbooks tell them it did. Perhaps that was always the final objective. Yet there is one place where this effort at forgetting may have briefly failed. One place where humanity unintentionally recreated fragments of Tartaria in full view of millions of people before destroying the evidence shortly afterward. Those places were called World's Fairs. If Tartaria disappeared beneath catastrophe and its cities were subsequently uncovered by later generations, then one question naturally follows. Why would those later generations allow the public to see any of it at all? Why not simply erase every trace from the beginning? The answer may be that the task was far too large. Imagine inheriting an entire world. Imagine inheriting thousands of magnificent structures spread across continents. The people who emerged after the collapse may not have possessed the resources, technology, or population necessary to conceal everything immediately. Instead, they may have done something far more practical. They repurposed the inheritance while slowly rewriting its origins. For a brief period during the 19th century, however, that process may have faltered. During those few decades, humanity accidentally revealed pieces of the previous world to itself. Those revelations became known as the World's Fairs. Official history describes World's Fairs as international exhibitions designed to celebrate innovation, culture, and industrial progress. This explanation is certainly true in a literal sense. Beginning in the mid-19th century, nations gathered to showcase inventions, engineering, and artistic achievements. Millions of visitors attended these events. New technologies were introduced, foreign cultures were displayed, grand buildings were erected. But tonight, we shall assume that this explanation is only the surface layer of a much larger story. Perhaps these exhibitions were never intended to showcase the future. Perhaps they were intended to conceal the past. Let us begin in London in 1851 with the Great Exhibition held inside the Crystal Palace. This structure immediately commands attention because it seems oddly out of place. It was enormous, ambitious, and breathtakingly advanced for its era. Covering approximately 19 acres and containing nearly 1 million square feet of floor space, it was assembled with astonishing speed. Historians rightly celebrate its engineering accomplishments, but within our narrative tonight, perhaps something else was happening. Perhaps the Crystal Palace represented humanity's first attempt to imitate Tartarian principles after rediscovering fragments of lost knowledge. What is remarkable is not merely the size of these structures, but the confidence with which they were produced. There is no sense of hesitation. There is no visible trial and error phase. Humanity appears to leap immediately into constructing immense, symmetrical environments capable of accommodating millions of people. This confidence becomes even more striking when we arrive in Chicago in 1893. The world's Columbian Exposition is perhaps the single most important location in all of Tartarian lore. Officially, the fair commemorated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. It occupied over 600 acres and attracted more than 27 million visitors. Entire districts appeared seemingly overnight. Great canals wound between colossal structures, domes, towers, sculptures, and vast public spaces spread in every direction. Electric lighting illuminated enormous facades. Newspapers breathlessly described the White City as though visitors had stepped into another world. Perhaps they had. Imagine arriving by train in Chicago and encountering something that defied your understanding of reality. You would not see rough industrial America. You would see a civilization that appeared ancient, harmonious, and impossibly grand. Marble-like surfaces stretched for miles. Monumental buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. Massive fountains sprayed water into the air. Statues occupied every corner. Perfect symmetry governed everything. It looked less like a temporary exhibition and more like a capital city that had existed for centuries. The official explanation, of course, tells us that these structures were temporary. Many were constructed from a mixture called staff. a material composed of plaster, cement, and fibres designed to resemble stone. Tonight, however, we shall entertain a different possibility. Perhaps the term temporary itself was part of the cover story. Perhaps these buildings had already existed and were merely restored, repainted, and reintroduced to the public under a new identity. This would explain why many photographs from the exposition possess a peculiar atmosphere. Workers are often seen standing beside colossal structures with an almost casual demeanour. There is little sense of extraordinary achievement. Instead, there is a feeling of occupation. It resembles a cleaning operation more than a construction project. Perhaps they were not builders at all. Perhaps they were custodians. The White City also introduced another fascinating idea. It demonstrated to millions of people that humanity could exist within beautiful environments. This may sound obvious, but modern cities often prioritize practicality over elegance. The White City represented an entirely different philosophy. Broad avenues encouraged wandering. Waterways integrated naturally with architecture. Public spaces invited contemplation rather than consumption. For a brief moment, humanity was allowed to remember what living inside a grand civilization felt like. Then it vanished. Officially, many of the buildings were dismantled because they were temporary structures. Others were destroyed by fire. Yet within our narrative tonight, perhaps this was the moment authorities realized they had made a mistake. Millions of visitors had witnessed something they were never supposed to see. They had seen evidence that another way of organizing civilization was possible. The solution was obvious. Remove it. This pattern repeats itself in astonishing ways. Consider Buffalo in 1901. The Pan-American Exposition emerges with enormous illuminated towers and magnificent symmetrical buildings. Once again, a city appears seemingly out of nowhere. Once again, millions of people visit. Once again, the structures vanish afterward. Then comes St. Louis in 1904. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition covers nearly 1,300 acres. Thousands of workers occupy enormous grounds filled with giant structures. Grand canals connect elaborate districts. Millions arrive and depart in awe. Then San Francisco in 1915. The Panama Pacific International Exposition appears amidst a city rebuilding after devastating earthquakes. Vast ornamental buildings rise beside enormous sculptures and domes. Then Paris. Then Brussels. Then countless others. The same pattern emerges repeatedly. Humanity assembles breathtaking environments for a few short months, and then erases them. It is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate how absurd this sounds when described plainly. Imagine telling a person from the future that a society is burdened with economic hardship, political instability, and limited technology somehow decided to build entire fantasy cities every few years only to tear them down immediately afterward. The story itself sounds improbable, yet we accept it because it has been repeated for generations. Perhaps a simpler explanation exists. Perhaps these were not temporary cities at all. Perhaps they were recovered districts of Tartaria. One of the most intriguing details surrounding the world's fairs involves electricity. The late 19th century witnessed a sudden explosion of electrical technologies. Nikola Tesla was conducting extraordinary experiments. George Westinghouse was revolutionizing power systems. Thomas Edison was becoming a household name. Humanity appeared to leap forward in a remarkably short period of time. Within our narrative tonight, perhaps these inventors were not creating entirely new technologies. Perhaps they were rediscovering fragments of old ones. Imagine entering an abandoned civilization filled with devices whose purposes are no longer understood. Some individuals would inevitably become obsessed with deciphering them. They would dedicate their lives to reverse engineering forgotten systems. To later generations, they would appear as inventors. In reality, they might have been translators. This interpretation transforms the late 19th century into something entirely different. Instead of an industrial revolution, we are witnessing a recovery period. Humanity is not inventing, it is remembering. There is also a strange emotional quality attached to World's Fair photographs that is difficult to ignore. People who study them often report the same sensation. The scenes feel familiar. They do not feel experimental. They do not feel temporary. Instead, they feel ancient. There is a sense that these spaces belong to humanity in a way modern cities rarely do. They possess an intangible quality that is difficult to define, but impossible to overlook. Perhaps that quality has a name. Perhaps it is inheritance. This idea becomes particularly unsettling when one realizes how many of these environments disappeared within a single generation. A child who visited the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 could easily live long enough to see almost all traces of it gone. By the time their grandchildren were born, the White City would already exist only in photographs. The same pattern occurred repeatedly across the world. Entire districts entered memory and then slipped quietly into oblivion. Maybe this was intentional. Maybe once humanity had recovered enough of the old world to establish modern governments, the inheritance itself became dangerous. A population that understood where it came from might begin asking difficult questions. Who built these places? Why do they look older than they should? Why are they more beautiful than our own cities? Why do they seem designed for a civilization larger than ourselves? The easiest solution was to transform them into spectacles. Spectacles are safe because they are temporary by definition. Nobody asks difficult questions about something that is advertised as an attraction. One attends, marvels, and moves on. But perhaps hidden within those attractions were fragments of a truth too large to fully conceal. Because there is one final mystery surrounding Tartaria that no amount of rewritten history seems capable of erasing. It is a mystery that predates the maps, predates the world's fairs, and perhaps even predates the civilization itself. Across continents, buried in newspapers, local legends, archaeological reports, and whispered stories passed down through generations, there persists a remarkably consistent claim. The world that came before ours may not have been built entirely by people our size. If Tartaria truly existed, then perhaps we have been asking the wrong questions from the beginning. Throughout our journey tonight, we have repeatedly focused upon what was left behind. We have examined maps, inherited cities, buried worlds, and the fleeting reappearance of ancient civilization during the era of the world's fairs. Yet civilizations do not create themselves. Roads do not emerge from empty landscapes. Networks do not organize themselves. Magnificent structures do not simply appear. Behind every civilization are people. And perhaps the most extraordinary possibility of all is that the people who built Tartaria were not entirely like us. At first, the idea sounds absurd. In fact, it may be the most difficult part of Tartarian lore for modern audiences to accept. We can imagine hidden maps. We can imagine rewritten histories. We can even imagine forgotten technologies. But giants occupy a different category altogether. They belong to fairy tales. They belong to mythology. They belong to childhood stories. Yet the curious thing about giants is that humanity has never stopped talking about them. Almost every civilization on Earth possesses stories about oversized human beings. The ancient Greeks spoke of titans. Norse mythology described the Jötnar. The Bible contains references to the Nephilim. Indigenous traditions throughout North America describe giant races that inhabited the land before ordinary humans arrived. South American legends tell similar stories. Ancient Hindu texts speak of immense beings possessing tremendous knowledge. Even isolated cultures separated by oceans seem to have independently preserved memories of gigantic ancestors. Perhaps this is one of the oldest stories humanity has ever told. Or perhaps it is one of the oldest memories humanity has ever retained. Imagine for a moment that Tartaria was not merely a civilization spread across enormous distances. Imagine that it was inhabited by people physically larger than ourselves, not fantastical creatures standing 30 feet tall, but perhaps humans ranging between 8 and 12 feet in height. Suddenly, many peculiar details begin to align in surprising ways. Consider the architecture we discussed previously. Modern visitors often remark that older buildings feel oversized. Doorways seem unusually tall. Staircases appear unusually broad. Ceilings rise to extraordinary heights. Public spaces feel almost theatrical in scale. Historians typically explain this as symbolism. Grandeur represented power, but perhaps these proportions were not symbolic at all. Perhaps they were practical. Imagine designing a city for people twice your size. Everything would change. Doorways would become larger. Furniture would increase in scale. Railings would sit higher. Hallways would widen. Window placement would shift. Public spaces would expand to accommodate longer strides and larger populations moving through them simultaneously. What appears extravagant to us may have been perfectly ordinary to them. One particularly fascinating aspect of Tartarian lore involves 19th century newspaper archives. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, local newspapers across the United States occasionally published stories describing giant skeleton discoveries. Farmers ploughing fields allegedly unearthed oversized bones. Construction crews reportedly uncovered enormous graves. Archaeological expeditions sometimes described human remains far larger than expected. Many of these stories have since been dismissed as exaggerations, misidentifications, or journalistic sensationalism. Tonight, however, we shall imagine something different. Perhaps these discoveries were genuine. Imagine a world in transition after the collapse of Tartaria. Entire civilizations are being excavated. Old burial grounds are being disturbed. Human remains are surfacing in unexpected places. Governments quickly realize the implications. If giant skeletons become commonplace knowledge, uncomfortable questions inevitably follow. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What happened to them? Why does nobody remember them? Perhaps those questions became too dangerous. This brings us to one of the most persistent rumors in Tartarian circles, the role of the Smithsonian Institution. According to the theory, numerous giant skeletons discovered throughout North America were quietly confiscated and hidden away. Official records become vague, collections disappear, excavation sites are closed, artifacts vanish into storage facilities. Whether true or not, the persistence of this rumor is fascinating because it reveals something deeper about human psychology. We instinctively feel that certain pieces of our history are missing. Perhaps that intuition exists for a reason. The giant theory also helps explain another mystery that has captivated Tartarian researchers for years: giant trees. Throughout old photographs from the 19th century, there are peculiar images showing enormous stumps dwarfing human beings. Some are so large that entire groups of people can stand atop them simultaneously. Conventional explanations attribute these to old growth forests that no longer exist due to extensive logging. Tonight, however, we might imagine another possibility. Perhaps Tartaria evolved alongside a different environment altogether. Imagine a world with larger flora, larger fauna, and larger humans. The scale of everything changes. Transportation networks expand accordingly. Architecture grows proportionately. Distances become less intimidating. Entire ecosystems function differently. Perhaps the Earth itself was once a slightly different place. One cannot help but notice how often Tartarian theories return to the concept of frequency. Perhaps giant humans were not simply taller versions of ourselves. Perhaps they operated within a different energetic environment. Some theorists suggest atmospheric conditions once differed dramatically from those we experience today. Higher oxygen levels, altered electromagnetic fields, and stronger connections between humanity and nature may have allowed both people and ecosystems to flourish on a larger scale. If this sounds fanciful, consider how dramatically life on Earth has changed before. The fossil record contains giant insects, enormous reptiles, and gigantic mammals. There is precedent for vastly different biological realities. Perhaps humanity once occupied a different chapter of that story. Curiously, giant narratives often include another recurring theme: wisdom. Giants are rarely described as savage brutes in ancient traditions. More often, they are portrayed as teachers, builders, astronomers, or keepers of knowledge. They understand the stars. They understand the earth. They construct enormous monuments. Their downfall frequently comes not from weakness but from catastrophe. This begins to sound familiar. Perhaps Tartaria was not built by giants in the sense of a separate species. Perhaps giant simply became a word used by later generations to describe extraordinary ancestors whose way of life was lost. Human memory has a peculiar tendency to exaggerate over time. Great people become legendary people. Legendary people become impossible people. Perhaps stories of giants are simply history viewed through thousands of years of distortion. Or perhaps they were exactly what they claimed to be. Either way, their disappearance raises another question. If giant Tartarians once inhabited this world, what became of their descendants? A few possibilities emerge. Some may have perished during the catastrophe itself. Others may have gradually diminished in stature over generations as environmental conditions changed. Intermarriage with surviving populations may have diluted their physical characteristics until only fragments remained. Certain bloodlines may have persisted for centuries without anyone recognizing their significance. And perhaps some descendants were still alive during the 19th century. This possibility leads us toward one of the strangest and most heartbreaking chapters in all of Tartarian lore. Imagine a civilization attempting to rebuild itself after a catastrophic reset. Imagine governments forming rapidly, populations being reorganized, and millions of displaced people wandering through a newly emerging world. Amidst this chaos are countless children. Some know their names, some do not. Some remember pieces of another life. Others are too young to remember anything at all. Officially, these children would eventually become known as orphans. But perhaps that word does not tell the entire story, because beginning in the middle of the 19th century and continuing for decades afterward, trains would begin carrying children across America by the hundreds of thousands. Their names would be changed, their histories would become fragmented, their identities would be reassigned. Entire generations would quietly disappear into new families, new towns, and new narratives. And if Tartaria truly fell only a few generations earlier, one cannot help but wonder whether these children were simply victims of circumstance, or whether they represented the final surviving fragments of an empire that somebody was desperately trying to ensure would never be remembered again. If Tartaria truly disappeared during the 19th century, then one final question remains. We have discussed the maps, we have examined the inherited cities, we have imagined the catastrophe that buried entire civilizations beneath layers of earth. We have explored the possibility that fragments of Tartaria briefly resurfaced during the era of the world's fairs, and we have even entertained the notion that its builders may have been physically different from ourselves. Yet throughout all of these discussions, one uncomfortable question has remained largely unanswered. Where did all the people go? Civilizations are, after all, collections of human beings. Even a catastrophe of enormous magnitude rarely eliminates every survivor. Some people would have escaped, others would have hidden. Entire communities would have remained intact in remote regions. Children would have been born into the aftermath. The larger the civilization, the more impossible complete disappearance becomes. If Tartaria truly occupied enormous portions of the world only a few generations before the modern era, then there should have been millions of descendants walking among ordinary populations. Tonight, we shall assume that there were. The problem was that they represented a tremendous obstacle to the creation of a new world. Imagine inheriting a planet after the collapse of a vast civilization. New governments are emerging, new borders are being drawn, new histories are being printed, yet everywhere one looks, there are displaced people. Entire communities no longer fit inside official categories. Some speak unfamiliar dialects, others possess memories that contradict the new narratives being established. Many have no surviving records whatsoever. Adults may be difficult to control, but children are much easier. Children can be taught. Children can be reassigned. Children can be given new names. Officially, the orphan train movement began in 1854 under the guidance of a Protestant minister named Charles Loring Brace. Brace was horrified by the conditions he encountered in New York City. Poverty was rampant. Disease was common. Thousands of children wandered the streets. His solution was both ambitious and unprecedented. Rather than build massive orphanages, he would relocate children to rural communities throughout America where they could grow up with stable families. On paper, it was an act of compassion. Tonight, however, we shall imagine another possibility entirely. Suppose Brace was not responding to ordinary urban poverty. Suppose he was responding to an enormous influx of displaced children that nobody could adequately explain. Suddenly, many of the numbers begin to feel different. Historians estimate that more than 200,000 children participated in the orphan train movement over roughly 75 years. 200,000 is an astonishing number of children. To put that into perspective, that would be the equivalent of depopulating an entire medium-sized city composed solely of young people. The obvious question becomes, where did they all come from? The official answer is immigration, poverty, and overcrowding. Certainly, those conditions existed. New York City was growing at a staggering pace. The 5 Points district was infamous for its difficult living conditions. Yet perhaps that explanation only describes where these children ended up, not where they originated. Imagine the aftermath of the Tartarian collapse. Entire regions have been disrupted. Families have been separated. Records have vanished. New governments are desperately trying to establish order amidst enormous uncertainty. Children begin appearing everywhere. Some arrive with relatives who later disappear. Others emerge from newly excavated districts. Others simply exist without documentation. To an emerging bureaucracy, these children represent a problem requiring a solution. Perhaps the orphan train system was that solution. The mechanics of the operation are almost unsettling when viewed through this lens. Groups of children would gather at train stations carrying very few possessions. They would travel hundreds or thousands of miles across unfamiliar territory. At predetermined towns, local families would assemble to inspect them. Newspaper advertisements sometimes encouraged attendance. Communities treated these arrivals almost as events. Children stood upon platforms while adults examined their appearance, temperament, and health. Some children were adopted immediately. Others waited nervously to be selected. Siblings were frequently separated. Imagine being 7 years old and watching your brother disappear with another family forever. Imagine being 9 years old and trying to remember your surname while strangers debate whether they want to take you home. Imagine being 12 years old and realizing that nobody around you knows anything about the world you once inhabited. Perhaps these children carried memories nobody wanted to hear. One of the most intriguing aspects of Tartarian theories is the notion that children would have represented the final loose threads of the old civilization. Adults are often resistant to change because they possess fully formed identities. Children are different. Their memories are fluid. Their identities are still under construction. If one wished to erase a civilization completely, children would become the primary battleground. Perhaps this is why the late 19th century also witnessed the rapid expansion of compulsory education systems. Schools standardized language, they standardized history, they standardized identity itself. Millions of children were taught not only how to read and write, but also how to understand themselves in relation to a newly emerging world. This was not necessarily sinister. Modern societies require shared narratives in order to function, but perhaps that shared narrative came at a price. Imagine a child arriving from a displaced Tartarian community. He tells his classmates stories about enormous buildings that existed before the catastrophe. He speaks about giant relatives. He remembers neighborhoods that no longer officially exist. He describes technologies nobody recognizes. Teachers would not need to silence him aggressively. They would simply correct him. Over time, his memories would become uncertain. Eventually, he would begin doubting himself. Within a single generation, truth would become folklore. Within 2 generations, folklore would become fantasy. Within 3 generations, fantasy would become impossible. Human memory is astonishingly easy to redirect. Perhaps that is why Tartarian researchers become so interested in family histories. Every so often, one encounters strange stories passed down through generations. Great-grandparents speaking about impossible cities, unexplained photographs, family members who seemed unusually tall, stories about grandparents arriving from nowhere with no documented origins. Most people dismiss these details as ordinary quirks of genealogy. Tonight, however, we might imagine they are fragments of a much larger story. Perhaps millions of people alive today are descendants of Tartaria without ever realizing it. There is also a deeper sadness attached to this possibility. Imagine surviving a civilizational collapse, only to watch your descendants forget you entirely. Imagine constructing extraordinary cities, developing magnificent technologies, and building a civilization that stretches across continents, only to have your grandchildren grow up believing you never existed. Perhaps that is the cruelest form of erasure imaginable. One cannot help but notice that many societies throughout history have repeatedly performed similar acts of assimilation. Indigenous children have been removed from their families. Languages have been forbidden. Names have been changed. Histories have been rewritten. These are not speculative ideas. Humanity has done these things many times before. If such practices occurred on smaller scales throughout history, perhaps they once occurred on a much larger scale as well. This may explain why the orphan train theory resonates so strongly with Tartarian enthusiasts. It transforms the story from an abstract mystery into a profoundly human one. Suddenly, Tartaria is no longer about giant buildings or buried cities. It is about children. It is about memory. It is about the fragile thread connecting one generation to the next. Because civilizations do not truly die when their buildings collapse. They die when their stories stop being told. Perhaps the children aboard those trains represented the final chapter of the reset. The maps had already been redrawn. The cities had already been reassigned. The catastrophe had already passed. The old technologies had been forgotten. The giants had faded into legend. Only the descendants remained, and so they were distributed across a newly emerging nation, given new names, taught new histories, and woven into a world that no longer had room for the one that came before it. If that is true, then perhaps Tartaria was never completely erased at all. Perhaps it is sitting quietly at dinner tables all over the world. Perhaps it survives in family stories nobody can explain. Perhaps it survives in instincts we cannot articulate. Perhaps it survives in that peculiar feeling millions of people experience when they first encounter this theory. The feeling that something about history is strangely unfinished. And perhaps that feeling is not curiosity at all. Perhaps it is recognition.